Hello, viewers. This is Qamar Cheema at the NHS Media, and I have with me Mr. Michael Kugelman, who is South Asia Institute Director at the Wilson Center. Thank you very much, Michael, for your time.
Always good to be here with you.
So, Michael, the first question is you have seen the resurgence of terrorism in Pakistan, a recent bombing yesterday in Peshawar. So, how do you see the developing situation in Pakistan, particularly the return of TTP and the attacks from the Baloch insurgents?
Yeah, that's just very concerning. And as you well know, I mean, this is not a new thing. We've seen this developing really for a few years. And I think we have to go back to the moment when you had a leadership change within the TTP. And that entailed reuniting a number of splinter groups of the TTP that had split off. That really strengthened the group. I mean, for one thing, Jamaat ul Ahrar, which was behind the Peshawar attack, very brutal, powerful faction of the TTP, had split off, but it was one of the factions that came back into the TTP fold. And I look at that, and this happened like 4 or 5 years ago. I look at that as a big turning point. From there on, the TTP started to make a lot more noise. And then, of course, you look to what happened after the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. That essentially gave TTP, which at the end of the day has been based in Afghanistan for quite some years, free, safe havens, sanctuaries. It made it easier for them to do things. And of course, the Taliban, now in full control in Afghanistan, has not been willing to curb the group, which has just emboldened the TTP even more. But I think what's particularly troubling about yesterday's attack, the Monday attack, was that most of these TTP attacks, most of the terrorist attacks in Pakistan over the last year or two, have been in rural areas, especially near the border with Afghanistan. They've targeted security forces. But, of course, this attack was in a major city. It was on a soft target. It hit a mosque. And so this is very concerning and suggests, not doesn't suggest, it shows that, these terrorists, these anti-state terrorists in Pakistan today have the capacity to carry out attacks in major cities. And if you throw in the Baloch separatist problem, which appears to have flared up as well, that I think makes things all the more troubling. And certainly for Pakistan above all else, but also for the likes of China, which has started to see its own interests and nationals be targeted by some of these attacks in recent months.
So, Michael, how do you see that why the guard was lowered in Pakistan? Do you think the gains which the Pakistan's military leadership or the Pakistan's law enforcement agencies had from 2015 to 2020, somehow those gains have been lost because some of the TTP terrorists are back from Afghanistan because the former Prime Minister Imran Khan, the former DGISA, wanted to have talks with them. So, do you think bringing back TTP militants from Afghanistan was a wise strategy, as the former Prime Minister mentioned in his few interviews?
Well, I mean, I certainly think that there were some major troubling policies that played out after 2014, 2015, 2016. I think there was so much attention, rightfully so, put on the fact that the counterterrorism offensive, especially Zarbi Azov, the one that was launched in 2014, was very successful, and that it killed a lot of terrorists, and it really degraded the anti-state terrorism threat in Pakistan for quite some time. But indeed, these anti-state terrorists were not eliminated, and of course, TTP, what was left of it, just moved into Afghanistan, and Pakistan was unable to deal with that problem, with that Afghanistan-based problem in those years. Of course, it was dealing with the government in Kabul that was not particularly friendly to Pakistan, the Ghani government, and so on. But then, indeed, you had unfortunately a case of the Pakistani state repeating the past historical mistakes of trying to hold talks with the TTP, which had not worked in the past and has not worked over the last year or so either. Yes, it did produce a few momentary ceasefires and truces, and that's good, but that was it. And they didn't hold. The TTP was not willing to extend them. And at the end of the day, I think what became clear is that the TTP's demands and talks were just way too ambitious for the Pakistani state to accept them. In terms of allowing the TTP to impose Sharia law essentially throughout the much of the region where they have influence. And these are not things that the Pakistani state would accept. And then more recently, the state has not been able to figure out how to work with the Taliban in Afghanistan to get them to be sympathetic to Pakistan's concerns about the TTP. Not a surprise, the TTP and the Taliban in Afghanistan are closely allied. There was no way the Taliban in Afghanistan was going to curb TTP. So, yeah, short answer to your question is I do think that Pakistan made a mistake by trying to conciliate with the TTP, just because the TTP was never interested in conciliation, much less peace. In the end, all that did was give the TTP more time to rebuild itself and strengthen itself. And then, of course, it was so emboldened by the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, it made the TTP think that it could do the same thing in Pakistan. And again, the Pakistani state has had no plan. And unfortunately, now its only choices are to do nothing, which I don't think is an option, or to mount some type of counterterrorism offensive, which could be tough given the economic situation and given that so much of this threat is based in Afghanistan, which means that Pakistani counterterrorism offensives that are cross border in Afghanistan could really raise the tensions with the Taliban there.
Mm. So, Michael, do you think, as per the UN Security Council, UN's report, that the resurgence of Taliban in Afghanistan basically supported the rise of the TTP as well? And we have seen the jailbreaks in Afghanistan where people were, just got released and they came in Pakistan as well, obviously with the support of the former government, which mentioned that. Do you think that here in this situation, the international community is there to support something Pakistan only? This will be a pat on the back, or do you think that it will be something important the Pakistan should expect from the international community because everybody seems busy in Ukraine or Indo-Pacific? So maybe this is another moment where Pakistan believes they are left in lurch. So how do you see that?
Well, I do think that unfortunately, Pakistan is really going to be left to address this challenge on its own. Certainly, there's going to be moral support and public expressions of solidarity and support from the U.S. government and many others around the world for sure, especially after this this most recent horrific attack in Peshawar. But I think that given that the U.S. and other NATO countries have left Afghanistan, there's not as much of a direct concern or threat to the interests of the U.S. and other NATO partners when it comes to this reality of resurgent terrorism in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. Only when it comes to terrorist threats that are perceived to be a direct threat to the United States and to other NATO partners would there be more attention to this issue. And I think the TTP certainly, it's a group that really worries the U.S. and so many other countries because this is a brutal terrorist organization that has had international targets in mind, and the TTP has been involved in attacks on Americans. There was one some years ago in Afghanistan where it partnered with Al Qaeda and the Taliban to attack the Chapman Forward Operating Base, which killed several U.S. Personnel, including some CIA officers there. And of course, the TTP trained a guy that tried to blow up Times Square some years ago. But I think the perceptions of the TTP in Washington have changed. I think it's perceived as a group that is fully focused on Pakistan, which I think is true. Now, given, and I think we've talked about this, given that the U.S.-Pakistan relationship has certainly improved since Imran Khan was removed from power, I think that does create some space, at least for some talks about possibilities for new counterterrorism cooperation between the U.S. and Pakistan. But keep in mind that U.S. security aid to Pakistan has been frozen for several years, so that sort of limits U.S. options. The new U.S. spending bill essentially imposes some pretty significant conditions on new forms of assistance. And also, again, the U.S. has moved on because it's out of Afghanistan. So I think that the best thing Pakistan could hope for from the U.S., other than solidarity and public expressions of support, is perhaps some more a willingness to share intelligence, to share more intelligence about the locations and movements of TTP in Afghanistan. Though again, with the U.S. not in Afghanistan, it's not as easy to gather that intel. But I think that's about it. I don't think it would be realistic to talk about a new U.S.-Pakistan counterterrorism alliance focused on TTP. That's simply not. There's a disconnect there in terms of how each country sees that threat. Obviously, for Pakistan, it's a much more dangerous, concerning threat than it is for the U.S.
But Michael, don't you think that since TTP is having having working alliance maybe with the Al Qaeda and Daesh and other forces which are present in Afghanistan. So, don't you think here there is a responsibility of the international community and the particularly of the U.S. To work very closely with Pakistan on TTP? Although TTP is a globally designated terrorist organization, but it's working with Al Qaeda and ISI. So, how do you see that the American and the Western commitments to counter Al Qaeda and Daesh vis-a-vis in Afghanistan?
Well, I think that the situation would be very different if U.S. forces were still in Afghanistan because, TTP obviously has a presence in Afghanistan, and if the U.S. worried about the threat to their own troops, then I think you'd see much more focus in Washington. But you're right. I mean, the TTP is indeed a internationally designated global terror group because of everything it's done in the past. And as I said, I think that the U.S. government will be open to conversations with Pakistan about what limited scope there might be for U.S. assistance. But given those obstacles that I mentioned before, I think that we need to keep our expectations in check. I think for Washington, the main focus certainly would be Islamic State Khorasan, as well as Al Qaeda and what's left of it, because these are the groups that continue to explicitly pose a direct threat to the United States. And now I don't know if you should believe this or not, but the TTP has publicly said on a number of occasions in recent months that it does not consider the U.S. a target. The TTP, of course, rejected reports that there was a threat to the Islamabad Marriott, that it would never target Americans there. I have to take that with some grains of salt. But I do think that when the U.S. conceives of these terrorist threats in the region, it's going to place a lot more importance on the likes of ISIS and Al Qaeda. But indeed, you're right. I mean, TTP is allied with Al Qaeda, and it's allied with other very dangerous groups that have global ambitions. So I think that presents a challenge for the U.S., especially if it's serious about wanting to figure out ways to move the needle forward a bit on its new type of relationship with Pakistan post Afghanistan withdrawal.
Well, Michael, the NATO General Secretary and the American Defense Secretary are in Asia. And obviously, they're there to talk on with everyone to counter China. So, do you think that these global terrorist organizations do they pose any threat to the countries in Indo-Pacific, or do you believe that they're only for they are considered as outfits in Middle East and West Asia?
No, I think that these groups that we're talking about, I mean, certainly Al Qaeda and Islamic State pose a very considerable threat to the Indo Pacific countries. I mean, we know that there have been uh, Asian affiliates, South Asian or sorry, there have been Southeast affiliates of both Al Qaeda and Islamic State, Khorasan, or groups that are loyal to them. And they've carried out attacks over the years, and this certainly has been the case in the Philippines and Indonesia. There are many examples of that. They're not as strong as they used to be, but I do think that, as Al Qaeda and Islamic State show that they've been weakened on the whole, the regional factions, I think, have continued to be a bit more dynamic. I would think that it's the Middle East where they would be the strongest now, but I certainly think that many of the, not many, but some of the Indo-Pacific countries, particularly those in Southeast Asia, are very concerned. And we've already discussed how, well, China is in the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, it's not a part of the Indo-Pacific policy, but looking at it as a geographic issue, China is very concerned about TTP. It's very concerned about Islamic State. China, of course, just signed an oil extraction deal with the Taliban, so it had to receive some assurances there. But China is very concerned, and we talk about this relentlessly intensifying U.S.-China competition. If there's one thing that the U.S. and China see eye to eye on these days, it's the continued threat of Islamist terrorism, particularly as reflected by the likes of Islamic State and Al Qaeda, for that matter, as well, which has had links to the Uyghur militants that so concern the Chinese government.
So, Michael, moving forward, how do you see the Indian National Security Advisor Ajit Doval's visit to Washington, D.C.? Um, he has met with the U.S. General, and he is going to have some very important talks here. So, how do you see his visit?
Yeah, it's a pretty significant visit. I think it showcases how the U.S.-India relationship is really broadening and evolving beyond simply, talking about arms deals and strategic considerations like countering China. I mean, that's a reflection of a strategic partnership. And tech issues have been one of those areas of momentum in the relationship for quite some time. And I do think that it's fueled to a great degree by mutual concerns about surveillance threats posed by China and concerns about hacking risks and so on. And I think both countries are keen to work together to try to figure out how to help each other out in protecting themselves from China-sponsored hacking and so on. And so, some months ago, the two countries announced this new initiative on critical and emerging technologies. And it hasn't been that much specifics about what it entails, but I think at the least it involves, high level attention to focusing on how the two countries can, share information and, build understandings about how to enhance these new forms of technologies. And the fact that you've got the two top security officials from both countries meeting specifically on the issue of tech is clearly an example of just how important it is for the relationship. And I do think that it will increasingly be incorporated into broader security dialogues between the US and India, certainly in the likes of the 2+2 dialogue. I mean, tech issues will be incorporated into that much more. Again, keeping in mind the China factor, because both countries are concerned about the surveillance risks coming from Chinese technology.
Michael, coming to the India being leading the G20 and SCO this year, and there is a probability that Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, Pakistan's foreign minister, will travel to India on the invitation of the Indian government for participating in SCO. Do you find there is a possibility of any breakthrough between Pakistan and India?
I don't think so. I think that the relationship is certainly calmer than it's been in some years, and that's because, in great part, because of the border truce that's been in effect for almost 2 years now. And also, I think both countries simply want to focus on other things. India wants to concern itself with the China threat, and Pakistan has its domestic situation to deal with. So each side has a very strong interest in not aggravating tensions with the other. But I don't think the political environment is right at the moment in either country for some type of reconciliation or even better ties. I think India is just very concerned about the domestic political instability in Pakistan, recognizes that this government in Pakistan is very weak and unpopular, and presumably it won't be around for much longer, assuming the elections happen in October as scheduled. Whereas in Pakistan, I think that despite all the conciliatory rhetoric coming from the last army chief and also from government officials about wanting to move on from the past and so on, I think there's just a lot of concern about the idea of extending an arm to or extending a hand to Modi. I just think there's a lot of concern with that. And it is notable that even when these Pakistani statements have called for better relations with India, every one of them is qualified with that point about, well, we need to, Kashmir needs to be dealt with first. India needs to change its policies in Kashmir. It needs to reverse its decision to revoke Article 370. These are not things that India is going to do. So I think that sort of signals just that how we should keep our expectations very low. Now, the time to take up this question again, I think, would be after the election in Pakistan, when it happens, if it happens, and there's a new government that presumably would be accepted as legitimate. That's when I think that there may be more opportunities. But again, we're getting into election season in India. India's got its election next year. And I think that it doesn't pay off politically, at least in Modi's India, to extend a hand to Pakistan. Right? I mean, it plays better politically to continue to take a hard line. And Modi's supporters would say, we tried. We tried to reach out to Pakistan some years ago, and we got hit hard with attacks, and we're not going there again.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your time for the NHS Media.
Thank you. Pleasure to join you.